Dear learners, welcome you again in this Swayam MOOC course on environmental politics, theories, concepts, and debates. In week 7, lecture 4, titled Challenges in Global Environmental Governance, in which we will be discussing the issues of compliance and enforcement. Then we will be seeing the fragmentation in global environmental initiatives. Along with that, we will be seeing the urge for balancing the environmental sustainability with economic growth and development. And lastly, we will also be seeing the role of technology and innovation in overcoming the governance gaps. So let's begin, learners. So this is the outline which I have just mentioned. So here we can see that global environmental governance encompasses the collective efforts of nations, different nations, institutions, and stakeholders too. And here, basically, it addresses the pressing ecological crises like climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, ozone layer depletion, etc. And here, we can see that despite growing awareness and international cooperation, significant challenges hinder the effective governance. So, in this regard, global environmental governance faces major challenges, which includes fragmented policies, weak enforcement, and conflicting national interest. And in this regard, it is very important to know that more than 2,300 multilateral environmental agreements exist, but at the implementation level, we can see that still gaps are there. And here we can see that why such gaps are there, because of the insufficient funding and weak compliance mechanisms. So in this regard, we can see that climate change alone needs around 5 to 7 trillion dollar yearly by 2030. That is just to fulfill the Paris Agreement goals. But developed nations often fail to fulfill their financial commitments. Along with that, we can see that geopolitical tensions also obstruct such cooperations, as seen in the delayed conference of party negotiations. And in this regard, we can take the example of soft laws like the Rio Declaration lack binding force, while deforestation continues at 10 million hectares per year, according to the World Bank report. And here, effective governance requires stronger institutions, equitable allocation of resources, and enforceable legal frameworks, that is just to address these systematic barriers. So here now we will be discussing what are the issues of enforcement and compliance. And here we can see that effective environmental protection is facing major challenges or issues, that is in form of enforcement and compliance, which basically undermines the global initiatives which are there to address these ecological crises. And here we can see that there are number of international agreements and national laws are existing to protect the environment, and that is along with to regulate pollution, conserve biodiversity, and also to mitigate climate change. Their execution often falls short due to the structural and political barriers. So in this regard, we can see a very primary challenge, that is what, that is lack of binding enforcement mechanisms in the international environment law. And here we can see the many important treaties, agreements like the Paris Agreement of 2015, which basically rely on the voluntary national commitments without binding penalties for non compliance. So that's why we can see that it is responsible for the a kind of failure of such treaties. And along with that, we can see that it also permits countries to unambitious targets or ignore them altogether. Even we have seen that some violations also occur, and here international institutions have limited power to impose any kind of sanctions, which may further lead to a culture of non liability among the countries. And at the national level, we can see that enforcement is frequently weakened by the inadequate institutional capacity, corruption, or political interference, particularly in the developing countries where environmental agencies usually faces the problem of lack of funding or even the authority. So here we can see that the another challenge is the asymmetry between the legal frameworks in principle and practice compliance. And here, corporations and governments often exploit the loopholes, engage in greenwashing, or prioritizing short-term economic gains over the long-term environmental sustainability. In this regard, we can take some of the examples like illegal lobbying, fishing, plus wildlife trafficking persist due to the weak monitoring and lax penalties. And here we can see that transboundary environmental harm like the air and water pollution creates jurisdictional complexities as polluters operate across borders where enforcement is totally fragmented. And here a transparent monitoring, strict penalties, and better funding for enforcement agencies are requiring for strengthening the compliance. And here, international cooperation like the shared database on environmental crimes and cross-border legal mechanisms could also improve the accountability. And here, which is very, very important and to a kind of remarkable thing, which is what that without robust enforcement, even the most well-designed environmental policies will fail to deliver meaningful protection for ecosystems and vulnerable communities. So now here we will be coming to the north-south divide and equity concerns, and here it is basically a kind of like a problem between the developing and developed countries. So here we can see that it is a kind of socio-economic and political gap between the rich and industrialized nations, which are often called as global north. And here the poorer developing countries, which are usually referred as the global south. And this divide is particularly glaring in environmental context where priorities and capabilities are vastly differ from each other. And here the most important aspect comes here, that is called the equity concerns, and it is the center of the climate justice, which demands fair burden sharing in mitigation, adaptation, financing, and technology transfer for the sake of environmental protection. And here we can see that the common but differentiated responsibility, that is as CBDR, which was firstly reflected in the Kyoto Protocol, enshrined in UN climate agreements, acknowledges this imbalance between the north and south. So in this regard, if we will see, so historically the industrial revolution in the 18th and 19th century set the stage for this kind of divide between the north and south. And here European and North American countries accumulated all the benefits of industrialization, wealth, and technological advancement. Meanwhile, many countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, that is also known as third world countries, were subjected to colonial exploitation, leaving them economically and technologically lagging behind. So here we can see that the historical legacy of colonialism plays a very crucial role in perpetuating the north-south divide. And here, during the colonial era, the resources of many southern countries were exploited to fuel the industrial growth of Western nations. And here, this process of exploitation is not only responsible for economic inequalities but also for environmental degradation, particularly in the southern region, as vast areas of land were cleared for agriculture, mining, and other extractive industries. So as a result of it, many countries in the south continue to face significant environmental challenges like soil erosion, deforestation, and loss of biodiversity, which are deeply associated with colonial economic practices. So here in the context of CBDR, if we will see, so it obligates wealthier nations to lead emissions reductions and support the vulnerable countries financially and technologically too. And along with that, it also emphasizes to ensure a just transition to sustainability. However, tension persists over the implementation, with the North often failing to meet commitments with the South and seeks greater policy flexibility to balance development and climate action in their region. Now here we will be coming to with what are the basis of disparities between the north and south. So here firstly we can see that economically the northern countries are being able to invest in technological advancement, which are very much important for mitigating the environmental issues, like renewable energy technology. They can invest on it too, advanced waste management system, along with climate change adaptation strategy. But if we will see the situation of southern countries, so on the contrary, we can see that many countries in the south are still struggling with basic development needs, and of course they are also facing the lack of financial capacity to invest in green technologies or even deal with the consequences of environmental degradation. So they are totally unable to do it. So here we can see that this disparity is evident in the several international climate negotiations, where the argument of the developing countries are what, that is for the more assistance from the developed countries to address both adaptation and mitigation needs which are related to the environmental protection. So along with that, we can see that another crucial part of this north-south divide is the disparity in the scientific research and technological innovation. And here we can see that the north has long been on the forefront of environmental science, conducting cutting-edge research on climate change, biodiversity, and ecosystem management. But on the contrary, we can see that the developing countries lack the resources to develop their own scientific capacity, often relying on the foreign expertise and technology too. So here we can see that kind of dependency is not only like limits their ability to alter solutions to local environmental issues, but also restricting their participation in the global environmental discussion. And furthermore, the scientific community in the north has historically dominated whole of the discourse on environmental problems, even overlooking or underestimating the knowledge system of indigenous communities or local experts, especially coming from the south. And this lack of representation and input from the global south has ultimately led to an environmental governance system this is bent in favor of northern priorities and further widening this north-south divide. Now we will be seeing here some data which is related to the emission of greenhouse gases by both firstly the north and then after the south. So here we can see that industrialized and post-industrialized nations are basically responsible for their great share in the historical carbon dioxide emission, that is as CO2. And here we can see, firstly we can see the United States America, which has emitted more carbon than any other country till date and is responsible for around 25% of historical emissions. In the same way, we can take up the example of European Union, including the England or UK, which are responsible for 22% of global CO2 emissions. Meanwhile, the third one is the China, which is historical contribution are estimated to be around 12.7%, that is almost half of the America's portion. On the contrary, we can see that India only 3%, Brazil more, I mean even less than India, that is just 0.9%, have not been the large contributors to the global emissions in a historical sense. Similarly, if we will take the example of the African countries. And if we will take the data that in the African continent, around 54 countries are there. But in a combined manner, we can see if all 54 countries are emitting only 3% of greenhouse gases, which is relative to the continent's population size, has also been very small. So further, we can see that a dividing line is also there in the climate negotiation, which resulted of the contrast between the past emissions and future emissions. And here we can see that the industrialized and post-industrialized countries of the global north are responsible for the majority of past emissions. And these countries, led by the European Union, which are implementing policies to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions too. And at the same time, if we will see that the emissions of most developing countries, particularly like China, remain on an upward trajectory. So the second group of countries will not reach to the peak of the emissions for another decade at least. And as a result of it, we can see that developing countries share the responsibility for reducing the future emissions, and it is highly connected with the issue of generational justice too, which we have discussed. What is called generational justice, which we have discussed in the previous lectures. So now here we will be seeing that the above mentioned historical emissions data, which is basically revealing a stark climate injustice, with North, particularly the US, around 25%, which was the highest one, and the EU, that was with 22%, bearing overwhelming responsibility for cumulative CO2 emissions. And on the contrary, we can see that the economies of South, like India with 3%, Brazil with 0.9%, and whole of the Africa, as I just mentioned, comprising 54 countries, only emitting 3%, have contributed minimally. It's very less in comparison to the developed countries. So here we can see that this disparity underscores the ethical imperative for the global north too, which lead to decarbonization efforts and honor climate finance commitments, which usually falls under the CBDR, that is common but differentiated responsibility. So here we can see that as the South pursues development, equitable solutions including technology transfer and green financing are critical to avoid replicating northern emission patterns. And along with that, it is also addressing this imbalance, which is essential for achieving global climate justice and sustainable development too. So here now we will be coming to the next section, that is key what are the areas of fragmentation of international environmental laws. So here we can see that fragmentation of international environmental laws refers to the proliferation of overlapping, inconsistent or conflicting legal rules, principles, institutions governing environmental issues, and this phenomena arises due to the decentralized nature of international law and the increased complexity of environmental challenges and the ad hoc creation of treaties and institutions to address specific issues. So firstly we will be discussing the causes of fragmentation, in which the very first one is proliferation of treaties and institutions. So here we can see that the growth of international environmental law has ultimately led to the creation of numerous treaties and institutions, in which we have seen a very common thing that each addresses specific issues like climate change, biodiversity, or marine pollutions. And this has resulted in a lack of coordination and coherence too. In this regard, we can take the example that the UNFCCC, the Convention on Biological Diversity, that is CBD, and the UNCLOS, that is United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, operate independently, often with overlapping mandates and limited coordination among these three. So of course it is creating an issue of fragmentation. Then here we can see the sectoral approach, and here it is what we can see that environmental issues are often addressed in isolation, which ultimately leads to the sectoral approach issue, in which we can see that it neglects the interconnectedness of ecosystem and global challenges. For instance, we can see that climate change, biodiversity loss, and desertification are closely interlinked but are governed by the separate treaties like UNFC, CBD, and UNCCD respectively. The next one is the regional and bilateral agreements, and here we can see that both the agreements further contribute to fragmentation by creating parallel legal regimes that may further conflict with the global frameworks. In this regard, we can see the NAFTA, which included the environmental provisions that sometimes conflicted with the multilateral environmental agreements. So that's why here we can see it creates an issue of fragmentation. Then here we can see the duplication of efforts, which is very like a common kind of thing in this regard. And here we can understand it through a very suitable example of overlapping mandates, which may further result in wasted resources and inefficiencies, as different institutions are also working on the similar issues without any coordination. Like here we can see that both the institutions like the International Maritime Organization IMO and UNFCCC, that is United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, both addresses the greenhouse gas emissions from shipping, but there is no coordination between both, which ultimately leads to the potential duplication. Now here we will be coming to the what are the consequences of such fragmentation. Fine. So here firstly we can see the inconsistency and conflict, and here the inconsistency and conflict is what key. Like fragmentation can lead to conflicting obligations for states, making it difficult to comply with the international environmental law, like the disputes over the relationship between the trade rules under the WTO, a very important financial organization, WTO, World Trade Organization, and of course the environmental agreements like the we can see the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. Along with that, we can see the weakened implementation of these policies, and here fragmentation can dilute the effectiveness of international environmental law through what? Through creating gaps in governance and enforcement. So as a example here, we can see that there is lack of coordination between the Convention on Biological Diversity and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has further hindered efforts to address the dual crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. Now we have come up to the third one, that what are the global climate change and solutions are there to reduce such kind of fragmentation in the context of environmental laws. So firstly here we can see that the harmonization of legal frameworks, and here the efforts to harmonize legal frameworks can reduce conflicts and inconsistencies, and this includes aligning the objectives and provisions of different treaties like the Paris Agreement of 2015, which seeks to integrate climate action with the sustainable development, and here aligning with the sustainable development goals too. Then it is about the second, that is the enhanced institutional coordination, and here it focuses on improving coordination among different international institutions, which can further address duplication and enhance coherence. For example, we can see the UNEP, that is United Nations Environment Program, which plays a coordinating role in global environmental governance, but its mandates could be strengthened. Then the third one and the last one is the integrated approaches. And here that is in form of adopting integrated approaches to environmental governance, which can address the interconnectedness of the environmental issues. Like the Nexus approach recognizes the interlinkages between the water, energy, and food security. And that's why it focuses on promoting the holistic solutions. Now we have come up to the next section, that how to make a balance between the environmental protection with the economic growth and development. So here, to make a balance between both, that is environmental protection and economic development, is very, very important. And how it can be achieved? Through involving these sustainable solutions, so that we can see that to promote both economic growth and environmental well-being through different strategies, like eco-friendly strategies, like the renewable energy, green technology, and responsible resource management too. So in this regard, we can see that sustainable development, which is a kind of broader concept than just the economic development. So here we can see that the concept of sustainable development first used in the Brundtland Commission's report, as I discussed in the previous lectures too, and it is a pursuit of the path of economic progress which doesn't impair the welfare of future generations. And in other words, we can see that sustainable development highlights the exploration of win-win opportunities that allow for coexistence of growth and development with the environmental protection. So here we can see that it focuses on the twin goals of poverty reduction and also the conservation of the natural endowments, as to protect it for the coming generation too. So in short, we can see that this notion expresses the meeting of the needs of the present generation without compromising the needs of the future generation, and its purpose is to ensure the intergenerational equity, which has been envisioned, that the current generations are obliged to leave an endowment of natural capital to the future generations too. So here we can see that each generation inherits a natural environment of a same time to which the earlier generation has enjoyed. So here we can see that the integration of environment and economic development has reopened the debate over the right to development, which basically came into mainstream after the arrival of NEO, that is New International Economic Order, at the time of around 1970s decade, which was basically opposed, not liked by some of the large industrialized countries. And here in Rio Declaration 2, environmental protection shall constitute an integral part of the development process. What kind of development? Economic development, and cannot be considered in isolation from it. So here we can see that the integration of environmental consideration affects international trade and economic development, plus balancing economic development with environmental protection necessarily involves the conservation of natural resources, despite the right to development being a real need. So that we can see that all economic development models should be environmentally sustainable over the long term. So this balancing exercise requires the collection and dissemination of environmental information, and also to conduct the environmental impact assessments. So here that is about this. Now we will be coming to the last portion, that is what is the role of technological innovation in environmental protection. So here we can see that earlier studies identified environmental innovation as a critical driver of the green economy and transformation too. And here environmental technological innovation can mitigate environmental damage and enable the integration of innovation resources with economic development, boosting core competitiveness, innovation, and green economic systems at the regional and global level too. So in this regard, we can see that the innovation in environment friendly technologies and the development of institutional frameworks are now become the essential factors, especially in reducing the adverse effects of carbon dioxide on human health and the environment too, as well as the transformation of global economic development. So in this regard, we can see that technological innovation is playing a very important role in mitigating the global climate change. And in this regard, the several researchers have shown that technological innovation is a fundamental driver of industrial transformation, as well as advancing and increasing quality and efficiency in the contemporary era. So here we can see that the global environmental governance faces significant challenges, which we have discussed in the very beginning. So hence, to overcome these challenges, there is urgent need for a stronger multilateralism, equitable resource allocation, and inclusive policy making. Along with that, recognizing the emerging role of technology and innovation to assist the process of environmental protection. Now here we will be seeing what kind of like eco-friendly technologies are there. So that is here in form of renewable energy technology, and here it is basically about reducing dependency of countries economy on the fossil fuels and decreasing the greenhouse gas emissions and also mitigating the climate change. Like for example, we can see the development of solar panels, wind turbines, etc. Then it is energy efficiency. So energy efficient technologies have also reduced energy consumption in the industries, transportation, and household needs. Like we can see the uses of LED lighting. Then pollution control. So here technological advancement have also led to the development of pollution control devices like scrubbers and catalytic converters, which reduce emissions from the industrial processes and vehicles. Then after we can see the waste management, and here innovations in waste management like recycling technology and waste to energy systems have also reduced landfill use and minimized environmental pollution. So in this context, advanced recycling technologies can convert plastic waste into the raw material for the new products. And lastly, that is about the environmental monitoring. And in this regard, technological innovations like remote sensing, drones, and IoT, that is Internet of Things devices, are also enabling real-time monitoring of environmental conditions and helping to detect and address the issues like deforestation, air pollution, and water contamination. And in this regard, we can see the use of technological innovation in the Amazon rainforest, where satellite imagery is highly used to monitor the deforestation in this area. So these are the activity questions which I have discussed in the previous slides, and these are the references which you can use it as further reading. Thank you.